They laughed at a Marine and his little girl for living in a broken farm. No one believed they would survive there, until a blind dog led them to a secret that changed their lives forever. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The wind of early autumn swept across the plains of Montana, carrying with it the dry scent of sagebrush and the faint promise of snow on the mountain ridges far to the west. Clouds were stretched thin across the sky, high and pale, so different from the heavy, suffocating storms Ethan Miller remembered from overseas. The road beneath his old Ford pickup was cracked and dust-caked, winding through miles of pasture land that had long been left unattended. Fence posts leaned like tired soldiers. Wires sagged. Cattle had vanished from these fields long before Ethan ever thought of returning. The only sounds were the steady hum of the engine, the occasional whistle of wind through broken pine, and the muted breathing of his daughter beside him. Ethan Miller was 38, broad-shouldered but worn down by the years. His hair, once a deep walnut brown, had begun to silver around the edges, as if winter had staked an early claim on him. His jaw carried the shadow of a beard that seemed permanent, not for style, but because shaving had always felt unnecessary outside of military protocol. His eyes were a stormy blue, clear yet perpetually guarded, as if they had seen too much to ever relax again. He wore a flannel shirt, sleeves rolled high, exposing arms roped with muscle and faint scars, marks of both war and work. His jeans were faded and patched, his boots cracked but still functional. He looked like a man forged by endurance, every line of his body a testament to battles fought and burdens carried. Next to him sat Sophie Miller, 11 years old, her hair a soft golden blonde, pulled into two braids that framed a face both delicate and determined. Her green eyes carried the brightness of childhood, but her lips often pressed into silence, giving her the demeanor of someone far older. She wore a hand-me-down woolen dress under a thick sweater, the sleeves too long for her small wrists. Sophie was quiet, not because she lacked curiosity, but because she had learned, far too early, that words sometimes only made adults sigh, fight, or leave. Yet in her quietness, she carried an unshakable trust in her father, looking at him not as a hero to admire, but as the one anchor in a world too quick to discard her. Between them in the back seat was Ghost, the German shepherd. Ghost was 8 years old, his once proud eyes clouded by blindness. A white cloth was tied gently across his face, serving both as shield and as symbol. His fur was thick, black streaked with silver down his back, though his muzzle had gone gray. Blindness had not tamed his instinct. He moved with cautious grace, relying on scent and sound more than sight. His ears pricked at every shift of wind, his nose twitching as though deciphering codes only he could read. Ghost had been given to Ethan by a fellow soldier who could no longer care for him. Despite his blindness, the dog's loyalty was complete, his presence steady, like a sentinel that did not need eyes to guard. Sophie adored him, often whispering secrets into his ears that she never spoke to anyone else. The road dipped, and then the house came into view, or rather, the skeleton of what had once been a house. The old Miller ranch sprawled at the base of a hill, its roofline sagging, its windows boarded or broken, its porch slouched like a man defeated by time. The barn leaned dangerously to one side, doors gaping open as if crying for relief. Ivy clung like desperate fingers to the outer walls, and the path to the house was choked with weeds waist-high. For anyone else, it would have looked like a corpse of a homestead, unfit for living. But to Ethan, it was the only place left. He parked the truck at the edge of the dirt drive and stepped out, boots sinking into the overgrown grass. The air smelled of damp earth and faint pine resin. He stretched his back, muscles aching from the long drive, and glanced at Sophie. She had already opened her door, one hand gripping Ghost's leash, the other clutching the strap of her backpack. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, but with the weight of uncertainty. "Is this really ours?" she asked softly. Ethan nodded. "It was Uncle John's. Now it's ours." Uncle John Miller had been a shadow in family conversations. A recluse who had abandoned the city, he had lived and died in solitude. The only thing he had left was this decaying property, whispered about in gatherings as that forgotten place. Victoria's family, sharp-tongued and affluent, had mocked Ethan relentlessly when the will was read. They had laughed, calling it a graveyard in the middle of nowhere, and had joked about Sophie growing up among rats and rotting beams. To them, it was proof that Ethan had failed, choosing dust over dignity. Sophie tightened her grip on Ghost's leash. The dog had already stepped forward, nose high, ears quivering. Though blind, Ghost advanced confidently toward the porch, tail stiff, his bark sudden and loud when he reached the front door. The sound echoed across the valley, bouncing off empty hillsides. Sophie startled, then frowned. "What's wrong with him?" Ethan watched, unsettled. Ghost stood rigid, barking into the dark gap where the door hung crookedly on one hinge. The dog's body trembled, not with fear, but with urgency, as if warning them of something unseen. "Ghost sees with his heart," Sophie whispered, her voice almost reverent. "He knows something's inside." Ethan laid a hand on her shoulder. "Dogs don't see with their hearts," he said, though his own words felt hollow. He had seen enough on the battlefield to know some instincts were sharper than reason. Ghost's barking grew louder, then cut off abruptly as the dog sat, ears still pricked, nose quivering toward the shadows inside. The sun was sinking lower, casting long bars of orange light across the house. Ethan pulled the rusted key from his pocket, the only remnant passed down from John besides the deed. It stuck in the lock, groaned, and finally turned with effort. The door opened with a long sigh of wood against wood. Dust poured out like a breath released after decades of silence. Inside, the air was heavy with mildew, mold, and something older, an odor of abandonment itself. The floor groaned under Ethan's weight as he stepped across the threshold. Sophie followed, Ghost padding close beside her, his nose brushing the ground, his tail low but steady. The living room was a grave of furniture, a sofa collapsed in the middle, chairs splintered, wallpaper peeled in long strips. Cobwebs clung to the corners, thick as cloth. The fireplace was clogged with debris, and the silence inside was absolute, broken only by the faint whistle of wind slipping through cracks in the boards. Sophie's hand tightened around Ethan's. "It feels like it remembers." Ethan looked down at her. "Remembers what?" She shrugged, her braids swinging. "Just remembers." Ghost growled low, turning his head toward the far wall. His blind eyes faced nothing but plaster, yet his body pointed unwaveringly at the spot. Sophie knelt beside him, stroking his neck gently. "He knows," she murmured. "He always knows." Ethan forced himself to push aside the unease. He guided Sophie into what had once been a dining room, cleared a corner enough for their sleeping bags, and set down a lantern. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the shutters like teeth. Sophie curled beside Ghost, resting her head on his flank. Ethan crouched near the fire pit, coaxing a flame from damp wood. As night fell, the three of them sat together in the ruin of the house, the glow of the fire casting long shadows that stretched and swayed like figures trying to speak. Outside, the land lay in silence. Inside, Ghost's ears flicked as though still listening to that hidden wall. For the first time since the war, Ethan felt both exposed and strangely chosen, as if the house itself had taken note of their arrival. The darkness deepened, but Sophie's small voice broke through. "Dad, even if it's broken, it's still home." Ethan looked at her, the firelight glinting in her green eyes. He nodded slowly, unable to find words. Ghost shifted, laying his head across Sophie's lap. The dog's white blindfold caught the flicker of the flames, gleaming like a mark of silent guardianship. And so, as the cold Montana night settled over the valley, Ethan, Sophie, and Ghost claimed their place inside the forgotten house, mocked by others, yet bound together by something far stronger than laughter or scorn. The dawn broke quietly over Montana, brushing pale light across the valley where the old Miller Ranch stood. The frost from the night still clung to the grass, glimmering faintly before surrendering to the weak warmth of the sun. Inside the dilapidated house, the smell of smoke from the small fire Ethan had kept alive lingered, mixed with the sharp scent of damp wood. It was a fragile beginning, but for Ethan, Sophie, and Ghost, it was the first morning in their new life. Ethan rose before his daughter, as he always did, stretching stiff muscles against the cold that seemed to seep through every gap in the walls. He was dressed in the same faded flannel shirt from the day before, sleeves rolled up, showing arms that were made for labor. He knelt by the hearth, coaxing the embers back to flame, while Ghost lay nearby, head raised, ears twitching at every sound in the brittle morning silence. Sophie awoke soon after, her braids slightly undone from sleep, her green eyes blinking against the light. She yawned, pulling her sweater tighter. Despite the cold, she smiled, reaching for Ghost, burying her small face in his thick fur. Ghost responded with a low rumble, his blindfold catching the first rays of the sun. "Morning, Dad," she said. "Morning," Ethan replied, voice gravelly from sleep. "We've got work to do if we're going to make this place livable." The day became one of labor. With sleeves rolled and sweat dampening his shirt, Ethan dragged broken boards from the floor, hammered loose nails back into place, and patched small gaps with whatever material he could salvage. Sophie tried to help, carrying small pieces of wood, dusting shelves, or simply holding tools. Ghost remained close, padding carefully through each room, nose lowered, as though tracking the unseen. It was in the dining room, while Ethan pried loose a warped floorboard, that he discovered something unexpected. The board gave way, and beneath it lay a small, leather-bound book, dusty and stiff with age. He brushed it off with his hand, the name John Miller etched faintly on the inside cover. His uncle's handwriting sprawled across the first page, bold but uneven, as though each word carried weight. "To those who dare remain here, the land holds more than it shows. Hidden in its bones is the treasure of truth. Only the patient and the faithful will uncover it." Ethan frowned, flipping further. The pages were filled with musings, memories of the ranch, strange notes about shadows in the walls, and cryptic lines. "If you hear the wind whisper indoors, follow it. The walls remember." He sat back, leather creaking in his hands. Sophie knelt beside him, her braids falling forward. "What does it mean?" she asked, curiosity burning in her voice. "I don't know," Ethan admitted, though a chill prickled his neck. "Could just be your uncle's way of passing time." But Sophie shook her head firmly. "It's not nonsense. Uncle—" "John left it for us. Ghost was barking at that wall yesterday. Maybe he knew." Later, while exploring what had once been the study, Sophie ran her hands along a shelf thick with dust. Books sagged from their spines, pages swollen from damp. She tugged at one, coughing at the cloud it released. As she leaned closer, a faint stream of air brushed her cheek. Startled, she touched the wood behind the books and felt it again. A steady, unnatural draft. "Dad!" she called, her voice echoing through the hollow house. Ethan came quickly, his broad frame filling the doorway. She pointed eagerly. "There's wind, inside." He placed his palm near the shelf, and sure enough, a subtle breath of cold air slipped through. He exchanged a glance with Sophie, her eyes shining with excitement. "The walls remember," she whispered, repeating the words from John's journal. Ghost lifted his head, ears pricked, nose turning toward the shelf as though affirming the discovery. While father and daughter puzzled over the strange draft, events elsewhere were already turning against them. Victoria, Ethan's ex-wife, had not forgotten. She was a tall, sharp-featured woman in her mid-30s, her dark hair always styled to perfection, her lips often painted in a shade as cold as her tone. Once radiant and charming, years of bitterness had left her beauty brittle, like porcelain ready to crack. To her, Ethan's return to the ranch was an embarrassment, a chance to remind everyone of his failures. She wasted no time in sending a lawyer. Mr. Thomas Grady was a lean, hawk-nosed man in his 50s, always wrapped in a gray suit that seemed pressed even in the Montana dust. His smile was thin, his voice smoother than silk, but edged with contempt. He arrived at the ranch mid-afternoon, stepping out of a polished car that looked absurd against the backdrop of weeds and ruin. "You must be Ethan Miller," Grady announced, his eyes scanning the sagging porch with undisguised disdain. "I come on behalf of Ms. Victoria Collins. She wishes to remind you that raising a child in such conditions will be noted, should custody ever be challenged." Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow, jaw tightening. "She sent you out here to threaten me?" "Merely to advise you," Grady replied smoothly, handing over a folded envelope. "I strongly suggest you reconsider exposing your daughter to this graveyard." His eyes lingered on Sophie, who stood partly behind Ethan, clutching Ghost's leash. Ghost growled low, the sound vibrating like a warning from the shadows. Grady stepped back, smirking faintly. "Good day, Mr. Miller." Word spread quickly through the small community. At the diner in town, whispers filled the air. Ethan Miller dragging his daughter into a ruin, too stubborn to let go, too proud to ask for help. Some mocked, others pitied. Yet among them was one man who did not join the chorus. Walter Briggs was 74, a weathered farmer, whose skin was the color of tanned leather from decades under the Montana sun. His beard was thick and white, his back slightly stooped, but his eyes, a steady gray, carried a quiet wisdom. He had seen families rise and fall, had buried a wife too early, and had raised children who now live far away. Walter was a man who knew both the cruelty of gossip and the strength of persistence. The next morning, Walter arrived at the ranch with a burlap sack slung over his shoulder. Inside were potatoes, onions, and a small loaf of bread. He stood at the porch, boots coated with dust, and called out, "Ethan Miller, you planning to starve that girl, or will you accept a neighbor's kindness?" Ethan, startled, stepped outside. Sophie peeked from behind the door. Walter smiled kindly at her. "Name's Walter. Don't mind the talk in town. People got too much tongue and not enough heart." He handed the sack to Ethan. "This place'll break you if you let it, but don't you give in. Don't ever quit." Ethan, though reluctant, nodded. "Thank you," he said quietly. Walter tipped his hat, his gaze steady. "Your uncle wasn't crazy, you know. He used to tell me this land had secrets. Maybe you'll be the one to find them." As Walter walked away, Ghost barked once, as if sealing the old man's words with approval. Sophie leaned against her father, clutching the journal to her chest. Her voice was filled with certainty. "Dad, Uncle John wanted us to find it. The treasure. It's real." Ethan looked at the crumbling house, at the shelves that whispered air where no air should be, at his daughter's determined face. For the first time since their return, he felt not only the burden of survival, but the strange tug of destiny. And in that moment, as the wind stirred the weeds around the porch, the ranch seemed to breathe, alive with secrets, waiting to be uncovered. The third day on the Miller Ranch began with a sky so wide it seemed to crush the earth with its silence. Montana mornings were always sharp, the cold air biting at the lungs before the sun stretched high enough to bring relief. Ethan stood on the porch, boots sinking slightly into the warped wood, scanning the fields that once bore crops but now lay tangled in weeds. Beside him, Ghost sat upright, blind eyes hidden behind his white cloth, ears twitching as though the earth itself whispered secrets only he could hear. Inside, Sophie rummaged through the journal they had uncovered. Her voice rang with excitement when Ethan returned indoors. "Dad, listen, Uncle John wrote something about 3 trials to test the faithful, 3 keys to unlock what's hidden. It's here, see?" She thrust the book toward him. Her slender finger, smudged with soot from touching too many dusty shelves, traced the words written in faded ink. Ethan studied it, his dark brows furrowed, lines etching deeper into his forehead. "Sounds like riddles to me," he muttered, but Sophie's green eyes gleamed. Not riddles. Clues. That morning, they began to search, following instincts sharpened by curiosity more than logic. The first discovery came from Ghost. Though blind, he moved with surprising surety, nose guiding him across the yard until he stopped at the dilapidated barn. His body stiffened, tail raised. A sharp bark tore from his throat, echoing against the hollow structure. The barn was a skeleton of what it once had been, beams sagging, hay long rotted, a stench of mildew and rust lingering in the shadows. Ethan pulled open the warped door, and a streak of light fell across the ground. There, buried beneath a pile of cracked planks, sat a wooden chest, its lock still intact, though rust had eaten its surface. Sophie gasped. "The first trial," she whispered reverently. Ethan heaved the chest into the open, brushing away cobwebs. "Locked tight. We'll need more than bare hands to open this." He patted the lid, half in frustration, half in wonder. The second trial revealed itself almost by accident. Later that afternoon, as Sophie wandered near the old stone well that stood crooked at the edge of the property, she spotted something glinting beneath a heavy slab of granite. She knelt, trying in vain to move the rock, but it would not budge. Her small hands trembled from the effort. "Dad!" she cried. Ethan came quickly, his frame casting a long shadow across her. With a grunt, he crouched and heaved the stone aside. Beneath it lay a tiny, corroded key, its bow in the shape of a cross. He picked it up carefully, dust crumbling in his palms. Sophie's eyes widened. "Uncle John left it for us. It has to fit something." The third trial took them higher. Ghost, once again restless, led Sophie by the leash toward the staircase that creaked dangerously with every step. The attic was a cavern of forgotten things, broken furniture, old trunks, newspapers yellowed into fragile parchment. Dust swirled like spirits in the shafts of light that pierced through cracked shingles. Ghost paused, nose lifted, then barked twice at a sagging beam near the window. Ethan climbed cautiously, prying away loose boards. From behind the beam slid a rolled scrap of parchment tied with twine. Sophie's breath caught as Ethan unfurled it. The paper revealed a fragment of a map, the ink faded but still legible. Crooked lines, a marking shaped like the well, and 3 circles positioned like sentinels. Sophie's voice was hushed, as though speaking louder would break the spell. 3 trials, 3 keys. Uncle John wanted us to prove we believe. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. He felt her small body trembling, not from fear, but from exhilaration. His own doubts, though strong, were slowly eroded by the conviction in his daughter's eyes. Perhaps this was not madness. Perhaps it was destiny. Yet, while the ranch stirred with secrets, the world outside grew hostile. Victoria, relentless in her campaign, had taken their story to social media. Images of her and Sophie from years past surfaced. Polished family photos staged in manicured gardens. Sophie in perfect dresses. Victoria smiling with the poise of someone who knew how to perform for an audience. "She belongs with me," Victoria wrote in carefully crafted posts. "No child deserves to live in ruins." The posts were accompanied by hashtags that turned whispers into fire, comments flooded, strangers condemning Ethan, mocking the idea of raising a girl in a graveyard of splinters, branding him selfish, unfit, reckless. Among those drawn into the swirl was Natalie Pierce, a local reporter in her early 30s, with a slim figure and auburn hair tied in a neat bun. She was known for her sharp eyes and sharper questions, always chasing the story that would stir the pot. Natalie had grown up poor, often ashamed of her frayed clothes and small home. That past had carved her into a woman determined to prove herself in a world that dismissed her too easily. When she saw Victoria's posts, she smelled opportunity. The next day, Natalie arrived at the diner with a notepad in hand, asking pointed questions about Ethan. Is it true he drags his daughter into filth? That he can't even provide proper meals? Some obliged her with gossip, others shrugged, but the narrative grew legs. Back at the ranch, Ethan was unaware of the storm building. He focused instead on the relics they had found, the locked chest, the small, corroded key, the map fragment. Ghost rested nearby, his blind eyes hidden, but his ears flicking at every creak of the old house, as though waiting for what came next. That night, as Sophie lay curled beneath a quilt, her voice rose softly into the silence. "Dad, do you think we can do it? Find what Uncle John left?" Ethan sat beside her, brushing a stray braid from her forehead. His face, rugged and weary, softened. "If there's anything worth finding, Sophie, it'll be because you believed first." Her small hand reached for his, squeezing tightly. "Then let's not give up. Not ever." Ghost shifted, a soft whine escaping him, his head resting near Sophie's feet. Outside, the wind stirred through the skeletal trees, as though echoing the vow made within the broken house. 3 trials had revealed themselves. 3 keys awaited their union. And somewhere deep in the bones of the ranch, the true treasure of John Miller still waited to be claimed. The morning of the hearing dawned with a cold silver light over Helena, Montana. The town was alive earlier than usual. Car tires hissed across damp streets, and the courthouse steps glistened faintly after a night drizzle. Ethan Miller stood tall yet tense in his only suit, an old navy jacket that hung a bit loose at the shoulders. He had shaved, though the lines of fatigue carved into his 38-year-old face were unsoftened. Beside him, Sophie clutched his hand tightly. She wore a pale yellow dress, simple but clean, with a blue ribbon tied around her braid. Her freckled face bore a quiet strength unusual for an 11-year-old. At her other side, Ghost trotted faithfully, the white cloth still tied across his eyes, his presence dignified as if he knew he too had a role to play this day. 2 nights earlier, they had fitted the 3 keys, one from the barn chest, one from the well, and one traced from the attic map, into a heavy lock hidden beneath the living room floorboards. The mechanism groaned, and with effort, Ethan lifted a square trap door. Beneath, dustless and preserved, was a small iron safe. Inside lay a folded deed granting ownership of the ranch and surrounding acres, several velvet pouches containing coins and heirlooms, and finally a letter penned by Uncle John himself. His handwriting was careful, slanted with age but firm. To the one who chooses love over comfort and truth over appearance, this home is yours. It was never the land that mattered, but the strength to protect what you cherish. Sophie had placed her hand on the parchment with a trembling smile. "It's like he was writing to us, Dad." Ethan only nodded, his throat too tight to reply. Now, standing before the courthouse, he felt the weight of those words more than ever. Inside, the chamber smelled of polished oak and paper, a solemn air thick with whispers. Judge Mary Ann Harlow presided, a woman in her late 50s with white iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun. Her eyes were sharp behind rimless glasses. She was known in Helena for her blunt fairness, having once raised 3 children alone after her husband vanished in her younger years. That abandonment had etched into her a stern patience, but also an intolerance for manipulation. Victoria arrived shortly after. She wore a tailored gray suit and pearl earrings, her blonde hair sculpted into perfection. In her early 40s, she still carried the poise of wealth, though her eyes darted nervously. With her was her attorney, Martin Cole, a slick man with dark slicked-back hair and a smile that seemed pasted on. The proceedings began. Martin stood, his voice smooth as oil. "Your Honor, my client only seeks what is natural, the bond between a mother and her daughter. Mr. Miller, while perhaps well-intentioned, resides in conditions unfit for a child. We have evidence of a decaying home, lack of stability, and we will show he cannot provide the secure environment Sophie deserves." Victoria dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her voice trembling with practiced sorrow. "I only want what's best for my little girl. She needs safety, school, love." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he waited until it was his turn. When he rose, his figure was sturdy yet plain, his suit sleeves slightly frayed. His voice, however, carried the steel of truth. "I don't have money for pearl earrings or polished houses, but Sophie has a roof, food, and more than that. She has me. We found proof Uncle John left the home to us, not for the value of its land, but for what it meant, that love was more important than comfort. And my daughter wrote something weeks ago when all this felt impossible." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a slip of paper. It was wrinkled, ink slightly smudged, written in Sophie's uneven hand, "Dad is my home." A hush spread across the room. Judge Harlow leaned forward, her expression unreadable, but her eyes softened almost imperceptibly. Before Martin could object, a voice from the benches interrupted. It was Walter, the old farmer neighbor. He had worn his best denim jacket, patched at the elbows, his weathered face glowing with a rare intensity. "Your Honor, I've lived by Ethan since he came back. He works his land, he feeds his girl, and I've seen him give up his own supper so she could eat. I've also seen Victoria drive past, without even rolling down her window. If you're looking for who shows love, it's standing right there." He pointed toward Ethan. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Judge Harlow tapped her gavel once. "Order." Martin scrambled, attempting to redirect. "Emotional testimony, Your Honor. Surely—" But Judge Harlow cut him off. "I'll decide what carries weight here." Her gaze flicked to Victoria, whose mask of grief began to crack. Another witness was called, a school representative who hesitantly admitted Victoria had once failed to attend meetings regarding Sophie's struggles in class, while Ethan had been present since his return. Piece by piece, the image of a perfect mother began to crumble. Outside, during a recess, Sophie stepped through the courthouse doors with Ethan. Reporters clustered, microphones thrust forward. Natalie Pierce was among them, auburn hair tied neatly back, notepad in hand. She had expected a story of a failed father, but what she witnessed was different. Ghost, lying patiently by the steps, suddenly lifted his head and howled, a long, low note that echoed across the square. The sound made Sophie laugh softly, pressing her hand against his muzzle. "He knows," she whispered. "He's telling everyone. He chose us." Even Natalie found herself lowering her pen, the cynicism in her expression faltering as she scribbled. Sometimes truth walks out of the courtroom on four legs, blind but certain. The hearing stretched on, each side pressing. But in the end, it was simple. Judge Harlow's ruling carried the clarity of a struck bell. Custody shall remain with Mr. Miller. Evidence shows not only responsibility but love, and the child herself has expressed where her home truly lies. Case closed. Victoria gasped, clutching her tissue. But no tears came this time. Martin Cole whispered hurriedly, already thinking of appeals, but the damage was done. Walter leaned back in his bench with a satisfied grunt, tipping his cap at Ethan. When it was over, Ethan knelt beside Sophie on the courthouse steps. She wrapped her arms around his neck. He closed his eyes, holding her tightly, the slip of paper with her words still pressed against his chest. Ghost sat beside them, ears pricked, tail flicking once in solemn approval. For the first time in years, Ethan felt not like a soldier fighting ghosts of war, but a father who had finally won a battle worth everything. The sky over Helena rippled in warm shades of amber, and rose as Ethan and Sophie returned from the courthouse. The weight of the trial had lifted, leaving behind a quiet glow of relief that clung to their shoulders like sunlight after rain. The farmhouse, though weathered and worn, stood waiting at the end of the gravel path. Its peeling paint and sagging porch no longer looked like ruins. Instead, they looked like promises, walls that could be mended, wood that could breathe again. Sophie leapt from the truck before it had fully stopped, her braid bouncing behind her as she ran to the front steps. "Dad!" she cried, her small hands pressed against the old doorframe. "It feels like the house was waiting for us." Ethan chuckled, stepping out slowly, his boots crunching against gravel. His face, usually taut with soldierly restraint, softened into something freer, almost boyish. The next weeks were filled with labor. Ethan worked with his hands, rediscovering skills he thought long gone, hammering loose planks, sanding down the porch, fixing broken shutters. He wore rolled-up sleeves, sweat streaking his brow, his auburn hair tangled by wind. Sophie worked beside him, not as a child who needed protection, but as a partner in rebuilding. She gathered nails, held the ladder, and, on afternoons when the sun burned brightest, sat cross-legged sketching designs of where new flowers should bloom. Sunflowers, she decided, her freckled face determined. They'll be like golden guards. Together, they planted rows of seeds around the fence line. Ethan laughed when Sophie whispered encouragement into the soil, her hands smeared with dirt. "If you talk to them, they'll grow faster," she insisted. Ghost, ever faithful, became their silent sentinel. The German shepherd's eyes remained hidden beneath the white cloth, but his posture was regal, almost statuesque. Despite blindness, his ears twitched to every rustle in the field, his nose lifted to catch even the faintest scent. He paced the property with measured steps, as though memorizing the ground through touch and smell. One evening, a delivery boy arrived with lumber. Ghost rose immediately, his deep bark rolling across the yard like thunder. The boy, Timmy, a lanky teenager with shaggy blonde hair and acne, froze, eyes wide. Ethan calmed Ghost with a firm hand, chuckling. "Don't mind him. He's the gate guard now." Sophie, giggling, tied a red ribbon around Ghost's collar that day, declaring him Sir Ghost, Knight of the Porch. Meanwhile, the community began to shift its gaze. At first, gossip still clung to Ethan's name. Online whispers and Facebook posts repeating Victoria's old accusations. Yet, word of the court's ruling spread, and more importantly, whispers of Uncle John's letter began to circulate, carried by Walter and a few loyal townsfolk. Soon, people drove by to see the once-neglected farmhouse springing back to life. Curious neighbors slowed, their cars to watch Ethan painting, or Sophie running with a kite across the yard. The story of the father who chose love replaced the scandal of the soldier who failed. Even Natalie Pierce, the auburn-haired journalist, returned one Saturday with a camera slung over her shoulder. She captured photographs of Ethan bent over a sunflower bed, Sophie holding Ghost's leash proudly, the old house glowing behind them. Her article in the Helena Gazette was simple. Sometimes victory isn't in courtrooms, but in the laughter of a child rebuilding home. One afternoon, Walter arrived carrying a box of peaches from his orchard. He was a stout man in his 70s, with a thick white mustache and a permanent sunburned glow across his cheeks. His denim jacket smelled faintly of tobacco and earth. Walter settled into the rocking chair on the porch, grunting with the weight of years, but smiling like a grandfather who belonged there. "Place looks different already," he said, eyeing the rows of sprouting sunflowers. "Didn't think you had it in you, Ethan." Ethan smirked, wiping paint from his hands. "Neither did I." Sophie leaned against Walter's knee, nibbling on a peach slice. She listened intently as he told stories of the ranch in his youth, of winters when snow piled taller than fences, and summers when coyotes howled all night. To Sophie, his voice was like a second library, one filled with memories instead of books. Not all moments were light. Some nights, Ethan still woke to old war memories, gunfire echoing in his dreams, smoke that wasn't there. Sophie would tiptoe into his room, curl up on the edge of his bed, and whisper, "The house is smiling now, Daddy. It won't let bad dreams stay." And somehow, it worked. Slowly, the walls that had once echoed emptiness filled with laughter, shared meals, and warmth. By midsummer, the sunflowers stood tall, their golden heads nodding along the fence line as if bowing to the wind. Sophie looked at them one evening, her voice soft but certain. "Dad, the house is laughing now." Ethan looked at her, his heart swelling with pride. He pulled her close, brushing her hair back. "No, kiddo," he murmured, eyes shining with tears he didn't hide this time. "The house isn't laughing, it's singing." Ghost lay beside them on the porch, his muzzle resting on his paws. His chest rose and fell with the rhythm of peace, the red ribbon still tied proudly at his neck. Walter rocked gently in his chair, gazing at the horizon as the sun melted into gold across the fields. For a brief moment, time itself seemed to pause, father, daughter, and blind dog sitting together, the ranch bathed in light. It was not wealth that defined them, nor the weight of Uncle John's inheritance. It was love, steady and unbreakable, that had turned a broken house into a true home. And as crickets began their evening song, and the breeze carried the scent of sunflowers across the yard, Ethan knew with certainty that they had finally, irrevocably, belonged. Sometimes the greatest miracle is not gold or treasures hidden in the ground, but the love that binds a family together when the world tries to tear them apart. Ethan and Sophie's story reminds us that God often works in quiet ways, through a child's faith, a father's courage, and even a blind dog who sees with his heart. In our own daily lives, we may not open secret rooms or fight in courtrooms, but we do face battles of fear, loneliness, and doubt. And just as God carried Ethan and Sophie through, He can carry you too. If you believe that home is not built with bricks and wood, but with love and the blessing of God, type Amen in the comments. Share this story so that others may find hope in their darkest hours. And if you wish to walk with us in more stories of faith, love, and courage, please subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and your family with peace, strength, and the unshakable reminder that you are never truly alone.